Hello, this is the Kratom Sobriety Podcast. This is another special Wednesday episode where we talk to different people that have alternative viewpoints about Kratom and draw on their expertise and their lived experience. And today we have Anne, who is an expert in harm reduction.
Yes, awesome. Thank you so much for having me. I really look forward to having this conversation with you. Not only because we seem to have many of the same shared beliefs, but I've been looking into your other content as well. And I just think it is so important to have robust perspectives. And I salute you for really doing that with the platform that you have here. So I am going under an alias today. I will go as Anne. I am a harm reductionist. I have a lot of experience in different areas in terms of substance use. What has put me on this path is I am a family member of someone who has struggled, and I have always found myself in a very similar role in life where I am almost riding shotgun to someone else's substance use or chaotic use. I am very specific in using and delineating the two between chaotic use and recreational substance use because there is absolutely a difference. I got involved in harm reduction advocacy because I spent close to a decade in family sessions in order to see my loved one in inpatient rehab. And they make you take these classes in order to see your loved one. And they're teaching you about drugs and they're teaching you about why your loved one is using and as a family member, what you can do. And I didn't know what Narcan was until I needed it and I didn't have it. So I'm going to put it that way. From that moment forward, I wanted to become part of a more concrete solution. And that is what has driven so much of my advocacy. I knew that in order to be a part of real policy change and effective change that I wanted to be a part of, I needed to go back to school. I did go back for my master's of public health with the emphasis in drug policy and harm reduction research. And during that, I was doing street level outreach with people that are actively using drugs and facing homelessness, have become somewhat of a support person for many of my former classmates that know that I'm involved in this work. And it's really a community space because if someone needs help and they don't know how to access it, if I get a call, I may not know the answer, but I know somebody in my roster and network does. And that's very common within the work that we do. I've worked in the acute care setting during the COVID-19 pandemic at that, and I was supporting people that use drugs in the emergency department, which was an incredibly transformational opportunity for me to learn the clinical end as much as I can without actually being a nurse or a doctor. So that's like the main shebang of what I'm about. But I am very heavily rooted in harm reduction advocacy. And I live by those principles, not only within my work, but in my personal life as well.
From everything I could tell, you walk your talk. It's definitely what you're doing is aligned with your beliefs. And today you're using an alias. Could you explain why?
Yes, of course. I appreciate you allowing me to use an alias. The topic that we're going to speak on today about Kratom, I'm going to talk about my personal lived experience of my loved one. And to the best of my knowledge, he is still in chaotic use if he has not already graduated into other substances. So by a means of protecting his anonymity, I want to go as an alias just to protect him.
Great. Can you explain the bigger picture about the scale of the overdose epidemic in America?
Yeah, absolutely. I think very easily put, the root of the overdose crisis epidemic is systematic and it's rooted in failed drug policy. It began with the war on drugs when we began criminalizing drug users. And that, of course, really came to a head during the 80s crack epidemic. And I know as a society now, we're all very well informed with the overprescribed medications of pain medication and the Sackler lawsuit, Purdue Pharma, all of that, which has now got us to a point of the government and that lawsuit giving different phases of money out to areas that were hardest hit. I think it's interesting, and I'm a firm believer that history always repeats itself. So there has not been adequate research in treatment towards stimulant use. And I do believe that is rooted in a racial construct because primarily Black people were using quote unquote problematic stimulants, i.e. crack, because it was seen as a poor person drug. However, when we think about powder cocaine in society, it's always been treated as a fun party drug or perhaps elaborate. And that's predominantly used by
white people, right? So society hasn't really started to care about overdose deaths until it was Bobby next door, the white kid who played lacrosse, who hurt his knee and got prescribed oxys, became addicted and died. Now, the full circle moment is the fact that as we continue to criminalize drugs, that also prohibition doesn't work, as we have learned from history. We have a more chaotic illicit supply of drugs and an incredibly potent opioid supply, and now animal tranquilizer supply that we can find in xylazine. So polysubstance use is on a rise, and now our overdose rates, more so than ever before, are disproportionately impacting Black communities. People that don't have an opioid tolerance, that are using cocaine of any sort, are overdosing and dying yet again. And it's really problematic from a public health standpoint, because I think we're moving the needle in the right direction in terms of health equity, but we absolutely can make all the programs we want, but until the policies are fixed, we're really just plugging holes in a sinking ship.
I think that if I understand, with the drug supply, because it's underground, in most cases, there's a lot of risk for it to be contaminated. So a lot of the overdoses are more like poisonings, and people are taking something that they think is one thing, but it's cut with another thing. And that other thing is what puts them at risk for dying.
Yeah. And that's definitely one part of it. I think and I appreciate you reiterating that, because it helped me think through it a little bit more. The second part is, as this drug supply becomes more potent and sedating, people, especially people that are facing homelessness with unstable housing, are turning to stimulants to offset that super sedating effect. A lot of the women that I have worked with in the community would use stimulants by a means of supporting their opioid habit to help make them feel safer on the street, help them not fall asleep, to put them adversely at risk for any sexual abuse that could potentially happen, which I think is an important anecdotal thing to keep in mind, the gender aspects of our overdose epidemic and how it disproportionately impacts the other comorbidities of people facing homelessness.
So it sounds like another risk factor is the polysubstance abuse. People aren't just taking uppers or downers. There's a mixing, and that mixing can be dangerous as well.
Correct. Yes.
When it comes to drugs, what is harm reduction and why is it important?
Yeah. So harm reduction is all about decreasing the negative outcomes associated with drug use. I think public health has really taken harm reduction by the head and has utilized it. I like to say that harm reduction is healthcare, but we cannot neglect that harm reduction is rooted from the experiences of people actively using drugs. If we are initiating any kind of policies or programs or interventions, if people that are actively using drugs are not centered in those conversations and decision making, then we're negating the core principle. Another principle of harm reduction that I firmly believe in, as I touched on earlier, in both my personal life and my career, is meeting people where they are at. I think this is really important in terms of advocacy, because harm reduction is a trajectory, and not everybody is at the ultimate goal of safe supply, right? On the spectrum of harm reduction, safe supply, if we had a safe supply of drugs, we wouldn't have so many of the other factors that we're constantly putting money into to try to fix. But our legislators, our decision makers are not there yet. And even harm reductionists, all harm reductionists are not quite there. So meeting individuals exactly where they are on that trajectory in order to advocate and build upon is incredibly important.
And just what are some concrete examples, just so people know, of some harm reduction strategies so that people understand what we're talking about here?
Yeah, some harm reduction strategies would be carrying Narcan, drug testing strips, be it fentanyl test strips or xylazine test strips, safe syringe access, overdose prevention centers, safe supply. That's in the context of drugs. And then we also use harm reduction every day in terms of wearing a helmet if you're riding a bike, wearing a seatbelt when you're in the car, wearing sunscreen in the summertime. It's all harm reduction.
Thank you. Do you have some real life examples where you have seen people have their lives saved or improved because of harm reduction?
Absolutely. And I absolutely love this question. And I might get a little bit emotional in my response. I see the positive outcomes that harm reduction has every single day. Some of my closest friends and mentors were revived because of Narcan. And had we not had Narcan, they wouldn't be here to be the advocates that they are, to be the peers shaping the policies within our healthcare systems, and definitely see it firsthand. And I think in my experiences in the emergency department and really bringing harm reduction into that clinical setting and coaching my patients at the time on strategies to how they could use their drugs safer is a really important sentiment of creating a safe space by telling someone, I don't care what you do. That's not for me to judge, but I do want you safe and I don't want anything to happen to you. And this is how you can stay safe. And then supplying them with those tools, be it those drug testing strips, making sure that they have Narcan and how to use it. And then those talking points, if they're a little bit resistant on any of them, of like how we can convince them to be champions for it in their own communities as well. That way, when they are ready, if they do become ready to seek treatment or care, they know that there is a safe, non-judgmental space for them to come back to.
At a policy level, what are 2 or 3 policy reforms that we could do related to drug policy that are within reach that we could make, that would make the biggest difference if we were able to do it? I agree with you. Safe supply, ending prohibition would probably be the most efficient thing, but not sure if it's going to happen in the next couple of years. It's going to have to be a social movement probably to make that happen. And I'm not going to write it off, but what are some practical things that might be possible within the political constraints of American society?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, how can we meet where we currently are on that spectrum? Like I said, I definitely want to really promote safe syringe access. It's not legal where I am, which is so silly to me, especially as we are experiencing a public health crisis of unstable housing and people that do not have sterile supplies for any of their wellness conditions. So safe syringe access is at the crux because we are potentially, history repeats itself. We will see the rise of hepatitis again. We will see a rise of HIV again. We're already seeing those increases in those numbers because people do not have access to something so very easy, right? A doctor could prescribe safe syringes and an individual could go to a pharmacy and get them if they don't have the money to buy them at the pharmacy. Mm-hmm. But then, of course, I do have to touch on that. There's stigma barriers to where people who are actively using drugs don't always want to go to a pharmacy to fill their scripts because they don't want to be perceived in any kind of way.
Yeah.
So I say that, but I also have that consideration in mind. We did recently, in my area, decriminalize drug testing strips, which I think was an incredible move that was long overdue. Paraphernalia laws differ state to state, and what is considered drug paraphernalia is really the hindrance as to how we can get the pin moving on a lot of our harm reduction policies. If anybody is interested in moving that needle in your given area, really understanding what your area's drug paraphernalia laws are, like step one, how to map out your advocacy plan from there.
Think access to Narcan is sufficient, and is it well known enough that you should be having that on hand and family members know that?
I think it depends on where you are. In the suburbs, I will still have people say, oh, I don't know anybody that uses drugs. And I have so many talking points to that of an overdose can happen anywhere. See, that's a statement that is rooted in stigma, whether it's an unconscious bias that an individual has. That's you saying that you think a drug user looks a certain way, when in reality, an overdose can happen anywhere. Your boss could be using drugs. Your server at a restaurant could be actively using drugs. And I really like to frame the idea of we are all first responders in this crisis. And it's almost our due diligence as a society to be carrying it. When I leave the house, do I have my keys? Do I have my chapstick? Do I have my Narcan? Always.
It'd be great if we get to a place where Narcan is just as available as heart defibrillators, and they're both considered just life-saving measures and doesn't have any stigma associated with them.
Absolutely. And there is a uptick in vending machines that provide Narcan or drug testing strips, harm reduction supplies. I'm working on trying to, with some of my colleagues, to try to implement them. And there's so much at play in terms of not only community buy-in, because that's another very important aspect of harm reduction is the community buy-in on our certain policies. Because if you're going to do something, you need to make sure that people can utilize those resources safely. And you're not putting it in a place that could potentially put them in danger of stigma or pushback from neighbors.
Before we get into some questions about Kratom and the personal impact on your life, I read on your website or your bio or something that you have a background in journalism and photography. And how does that inform your thinking and work around this stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I started in harm reduction advocacy, I was a journalism undergrad at the time, and I wanted to be able to use my camera for social change and really center the experiences and solutions and so I started creating educational materials for the city that was like public service announcements about how to use Narcan, interviewing people in a very ethical way. It's also made me very protective of people in vulnerable situations, especially people that are actively using drugs. I think there is such profound meaning to lived experience, but our society is so hooked on clickbait and trauma porn that there's a way to tell a story without putting someone else in further danger. And I don't quite believe we've gotten there as a whole. So I like to use a lot of my writings for op-eds in the newspaper on these issues, helps me speak to a lot of the interventions that have come about. And in most of my pieces, I will always cite a certified recovery specialist, someone with lived experience, and or someone who is actively using drugs, most likely under an alias, just so I can protect them.
Some of my early episodes, I was trying to create some imagery to promote the episodes. I was like, yeah, those images I created for the first couple ones, that I'm playing too much into like hysterical drug porn kind of imagery that's not helpful. Maybe it would get some eyeballs on something. Headline writers have the same problem, shock value. And so I understand that kind of the balance. You don't want to play into the stereotypes of the thing that we're trying to change.
Yeah. And there's definitely like a grace that you have to give yourself. I've not always been perfect. One of the first people that I ever interviewed, I had him fully on camera, and I didn't have a lot of journalistic control over the questions that were being asked to him. And that was a huge learning experience. He actually overdosed the same day that I interviewed him. I never released the footage, and that was a big reason I really wanted to learn about harm reduction, because my camera wasn't going to save somebody's life. God forbid something happened in front of it. So really dialing back and saying, like, how can I actually save a life? And then the journalism aspect took like a supportive role in that, but not the lead role.
Got it. I understand the trajectory now of your career and how you ended up where you are now. Another part of your story is I know you have some personal experience with a loved one who used Kratom. You mentioned it earlier in the episode, and you have some beautiful writing, and thanks for offering to let us put it up on our website for the podcast. When this episode is published, we'll have Anne's writing. How would you describe it?
I think it's like a first person narrative. And then I also wanted to include the lived experiences of people who have used Kratom in the past or were still actively using Kratom at the time. And I didn't want to interview people that really thought or experienced things the same way that I did, so I could show the diversity in the experiences. And it just so happened that the outcome, takeaways, and perspectives were pretty much all aligned.
It's truly Kratom, I think, is one of the most nuanced things out there. It's not all bad. It's not all good. And the debate often swings from one extreme to the other. And it's even in my community, the quitting community, when I mentioned that I was going to have a harm reduction expert, there was a little bit of pushback because many people, after this bad experience with Kratom, I can never recommend to anybody ever to use Kratom. Your writing really captured that. So thanks for letting us put that on our website. And so why don't I quote from it, and then you can tell us more about your personal experience. You wrote, quote, "What prevailed from this early morning was a chaotic journey that soon spiraled out of control. And despite every attempt at meeting my loved one where they were at, it was not a relationship with a substance that offered any therapeutic value anymore. It was out of control and led to the very same life spiral that illicit drugs once did for them."
Yes, for context, my loved one was in sustained recovery from opioids and stimulants. He began using Kratom. He's a laborer, so working really hard with his hands and his body. And that was always a concern for me. And that's an ongoing concern with the people that I care about who are in recovery. Many of them work those labor type jobs because of the factors of that their substance use has maybe taken them away from a degree program. Maybe school wasn't for them, whatever the case may be. These hard labor jobs are hard on the body. And I say this because anecdotally, at least, it does create this pocket of individuals who can be disproportionately targeted for substances, for pain relief, things like that. So he started using kratom for energy. His boss at the time offered it to him because he had hurt his knee on the job and was just feeling really tired. And he was like, hey, take this. It's just like a 5-hour energy. And it looked like a 5-hour energy drink. The tincture that he used, it came in the bottle. That was his way of ingestion. And that form of kratom is incredibly potent. So started using it, did say he didn't know what it was at the time, and then didn't realize that it was a problem until he tried to not take it one day in about a week's time from first starting it and couldn't stop. Felt the onset of some mild withdrawal symptoms, didn't really know how to identify it, turned to Reddit, and then started to freak out because he noticed all of these subreddits of people who were trying to stop and couldn't. With that, I think it elicited a lot of shame from a person who had beaten fentanyl, right? Who got off fentanyl, who got off cocaine. And now there is a stigma in the recovery community, and there is a stigma in the harm reduction community and I think two things can exist at the same time. And I say that because I really want that message to hit home. It was a huge lesson for me as a harm reductionist and also as a family member. Two things can absolutely exist at the same time, swaying between the principles of understanding, creating a safe, compassionate space for the person that I loved, and that my boundaries were also very important, while also seeing that this was not a therapeutic relationship. It grew out of control. He hid it for about 6 months, which speaks to the level of shame that goes with it, but also to the level of maybe some character defects. And I say that just for a lack of a better term. I don't mean to elicit any stigma for people that use drugs by saying that, but it's a tendency that is common amongst people who are actively using drugs to revert to choices and behaviors that do not best serve them because the decision maker of their brain is completely hijacked by a substance. It was an incredibly heartbreaking experience. It toughed it out for over 2 years. It only got worse. It felt like my entire life was turned upside down, like the bills weren't being paid unless I was paying them. I didn't have my best friend to come home to anymore. I never knew what version of him I was going to get. Super distracted. When I say I could tell a whole story and he not even hear what I said because he was so disassociating, so disassociative, to the point where I started to learn about kratom. I wanted to understand it. And as a harm reductionist, it got to a point to where I had him bring it inside and keep it by the coffee. And he wanted to stop.
That is hard. And most of our audience are people who recently quit or are trying to quit and are having trouble or have a couple of months of recovery in from being able to stop using kratom. And I'm sure it'll hit their heartstrings knowing they probably have loved ones that were just like you.
I could speak to the taper aspect about how I used harm reduction to meet him where he was. And I just asked that he not keep it from me and then bring it inside.
Tell us about that.
Yes, using my experience in understanding harm reduction strategies and just not judging someone when they're in that chaotic space to further alienate them more. I'm not a believer in tough love, but I do believe that family members can be impacted by that chaotic use state, and they are entitled to whatever boundaries they need to set to keep their home and themselves safe. So we sat down and we talked about it multiple times. He said that he was really struggling to stop, how on the subreddits there were taper plans. I was fortunate enough to have people within my network to be able to prescribe some very low state comfort medications to where our weekends when he wasn't elsewhere turned into just detoxes. And I'm not a detox center. I loved him. And I think in retrospect, looking back, I was willing to do whatever it took. So he knew that I supported him because he disclosed that he was ashamed. He disclosed that he wants to stop and can't. He felt pressure from work. He felt pressure, immense pressure from his family to the point where he couldn't go to a detox. He couldn't go away. So we would try to taper and I would have him bring it in So they weren't hidden in his car. And I had him keep it next to the Keurig where we would drink our coffee because I wanted him to feel like he didn't have to hide it. And then we stuck to the plan of, okay, so you're at 2 bottles. We're going to slowly taper down and follow this taper plan. We're going to get down to a bottle by next week. And then we're going to be at 3/4 of a bottle for a couple days. And it got to, I remember it was in October and I went to get Halloween decorations and he was drinking it out of the bottles. And one of the decorations were like those plastic syringes that are for like some weird
Costume?
Yeah, some costume. But I bought it as a medicine dropper for his kratom because he was struggling to taper because the bottles are dark. So he couldn't see how much was in it. And it was a nightmare. It was a nightmare. And I was like trying to be supportive, but it was so outside of my control. Like I said, 2 years. And it took about a year for me to really notice how much it changed his personality, the anger, the rage. And that, of course, evokes it within me. I'm not a perfect person either. And I'm coming to peace with how that impacted me and forced me to show up and create some wounds that I need to address within myself. It's insane that someone can buy this at a gas station and not know what it is. My experience with kratom prior to this was I knew that people used it to offset if they had a return to use to opioids and it would help their withdrawal symptoms. I think from a harm reduction lens, yes, I can understand that. And then I also know individuals who were in recovery who started to dabble with kratom because it was like a free high, for lack of a better. Individuals don't have to be in recovery, but if you're making millions and billions of dollars off of a product that you're mismarketing and not at least putting the warnings out there, it's public health prevention by getting kratom regulated, truly.
I heard a new one this week was we can't warn people about kratom because it will make it more enticing to children. That one blew my mind.
It almost feels like very hush and stigmatizing, where the root of problematic use or chaotic use is not through experimentation. The root of so much of addiction from the brain disease model is trauma. It's hurt. That's if you put a room of people who have struggled with addiction and you ask each person their story, right? The one commonality amongst everyone is pain.
Yes.
No matter what the drug is.
Do you have any other advice for family members with a relative or partner or friend that's addicted to kratom?
Yeah, I think in my experiences, I don't regret how much tolerance, for lack of a better, I gave. It definitely exhausted me. It's definitely caused me a lot of trauma and things that I have to heal from and a whole lot of heartbreak that I'm still trying to recover from. But I wouldn't take any of it back because I knew that I was, like you said in the beginning, and I really appreciate, this was a life moment for me to live what I preach. And that's incredibly difficult when it's inside of your home. And I had to do it with respect to myself. Yes, I let it in the house, but only for a period of time. When it wasn't working, like I knew when to stop. I knew when to say this is no longer working because now I'm being taken advantage of, whether it's him doing it or it's his brain being hijacked, it doesn't matter. It's the fact that this is actually happening and I need to change something or nothing's going to change. And as a family member, you can't control. Nothing you do is going to control that addiction. Try to remain as a safe space for your individual to know that they can speak to you without judgment. And if they do want to get help, they know that they can come to you, but you're not wrong for any boundaries that you set. And that goes back to the point of two things can exist at the same time. I feel almost like I'm contradicting myself as somebody who is a tolerant person, especially when somebody is on drugs, because we know the outcome, especially in this drug supply, could mean death. You still have a right to preserve yourself and your safety. Because if you're not safe, nothing is safe around you.
Thank you. Do experts distinguish between harm reduction interventions such as needle exchange or Narcan distribution versus using another substance that's maybe perceived as safer, like cannabis or kratom, as an alternative?
Really glad you asked that. I don't know of any studies. There's not really a lot of kratom-based studies when you consider the big spectrum of addiction medicine and substance use research. I think it's because it's so new and it's ever changing. especially without that regulation, right? Like, how can we treat something that's not regulated so we don't even know the ingredients, right? I would look up the lot number of the product that he would use. And it's this beautifully crafted website. It feels like it's the gentrification of drugs, truly. And I would put in the lot number. It would assure me via copy that it's a safe, organic, blah, blah, blah. But then the records are down. I've never been able to track any of the lot numbers to understand the batch it came from, to know the potency and whatever the hell else, which is telling to lack of regulation. Anecdotally, I struggle because I feel like people have brushed this experience off because we're so used to it being fentanyl. I felt crazy. It like manipulated and gaslit me. Oh my gosh, this isn't fentanyl, so it can't be that bad. The trajectory is there. In the piece that I wrote, somebody in that has returned to use and is in full-blown chaotic use to fentanyl. My friends that are in recovery who I've talked to about this, everyone who has touched kratom while in recovery went back to using a more illicit supply. Kratom is expensive. And just because you have money for it, it's doing things to your brain and to your body that are just so dangerous, and people are just not informed of the long term at all.
I think the prevailing wisdom is don't fuss about kratom. It's safer. And at the same time, they're saying if you say something bad about kratom because it's a harm reduction option, you're like,
you're a cop, right?
Yeah, you're a narc. And I guess that's the next question is similar. I think there's some parallels around like nicotine vaping appears to be safer, if I understand right, than regular cigarettes. I know there's some debate about it, and people are saying similar things about kratom. But what happens is there's industries behind both vaping and kratom, and there's these like fan bases behind both of them that are really big proponents. They don't want any bad mouthing about kratom, no bad mouthing about vaping. Both of them are safer. Do you see any parallels between those debates?
Oh yeah, 100%. And it's hard, especially within the smoking cessation work when it's relative to drugs. I think as a whole, we need to really understand that the culture of drugs and the culture of withdrawal is so different now than it was 5 to 10 years ago, especially 15 to 20 years ago. Introducing smoking cessation for individuals that are just coming off something so highly potent, probably not the right time, but there is adequate research that in the emergency department, introducing smoking cessation, like the patch or anything like that, is an effective measure to wellness and engagement. So the numbers are there. As I develop more into my career in public health, I have never really been on the prevention end of things. I'm just now getting into the prevention world.
Okay.
Whereas where I've always been has been like, how the hell are we going to figure out everything that's already wrong? Where I can hold space for the prevention aspects of this, protecting children, things like that. Now, when I am mad about kratom and I have my resentments and know how dangerous this is, regulation is not prohibition, because I don't want it to be more difficult for people that are already on it. But I also know that comes at a cost. That's just the reality of it. I have to recognize it. I don't have all of the answers, but if we could prevent more individuals from taking it, or at least being more informed of what they're getting into, that's at least one step in the right direction.
Keeping it legal and resisting prohibition, then there is a challenge of demand production, similar with the way opiates were dispensed. And I think there is that dynamic with kratom, that there's a big for-profit motive for that. So I do not have the solution for that either.
Yeah, if I think about my loved one, like I'm at a point now where I'm waiting for that phone call. And then in retrospect, God forbid I get that phone call, am I ever going to look back and say, oh, I wish he just stayed taking kratom? Because I even offered that up as an opportunity for him early on. I said, if you feel that this can be a therapeutic option for you, if this is a part of your life and you want this to be a part of your life, and this is something that I need to accept, then this is something I also need to work on. I tried to have an open mind, but it wasn't positive for him. It wasn't. And everybody's different. I'm not saying that experience is going to be everywhere, but it's really tough. And it really makes me mad that every 200 feet is a new smoke shop with kratom illuminated in neon. It's like haunting me.
That's more the demand production and the profiteering that's coming from this. Another dynamic is that it is totally true. Not everybody has the experience of your loved one or the one I had or the one that a lot of our listeners have. And I believe people when they report that they do have a therapeutic relationship with kratom. So that makes it even more nuanced, the debate and trying to find a regulatory solution.
But also at the same time, there's no, and I'm not taking this away from individuals who have chronic pain, who because of the overprescribing that had happened and the access points of the PDMP that limit people access to pain medications that will work for them, right? And maybe they use kratom to supplement. That doesn't take any of that away. So it's very complex and it's really difficult.
I know you're very committed to reducing stigma about drug use. What are some practical steps that we can do to combat stigma and better support individuals struggling with substance abuse?
Yeah, I think language is always step one. How we speak about things helps shape the way we understand them and treat them. You are always a living example of what you say and what you do. And you never know who is listening and who is watching you, and not in a creepy way, but you could be inspiring somebody. When somebody hears you speak correctly, they will likely ask you, hey, why did you choose to say it like that? Simple as that. Be a living example. I think another way to address stigma is self-preservation is important, especially in the advocacy realm. I have come to terms, I am not going to exert my energy with an individual that thinks people that use drugs should just die. I'm not going there because you just value life in a way that I do not and will never, that I'm going to save that. But truly just meeting people exactly where they are and not being afraid to ask questions. If you hear someone say a statement that's stigmatizing, it's likely rooted in a painful experience that they have had, be it themselves or a loved one has caused them, and drugs were that confounding factor. So picking that apart and holding space for that hurt. Some people just really want to be heard, and then they can move past it.
Listening is always a good solution to a lot of situations. You already touched on this and you really nailed it earlier, but with kratom, one of the issues is the stigma. You get it from all angles. The industry insists that any overuse of kratom is related to lack of consumer responsibility. You've heard the top lobbyists say kratom addiction is a form of self-harm. And then kratom enthusiasts, because they want kratom to remain legal and be normalized, they will claim it's only the losers get addicted to kratom. And we're the ones giving it a bad name. And then a lot of family members don't understand it because it's over-the-counter supplement. And I've heard people say, it'd almost be easier if I would just relapse back on pills or do booze, because the other issue is in the recovery community doesn't know what to do with us either.
And it's so common in the recovery community. I know like all of the recovery houses local to me, they now test for kratom. There's a special dip that you gotta buy that's not on a regular drug panel. And that was something else I did with my partner. I don't really like drug tests. I understand it from a medical standpoint. You don't want to give someone a medication if they have something in their system that could potentially further harm them. But I asked him, I let him be the driver to a degree. And he wanted the drug test for accountability. And an interesting aspect of it was he kept asking, I knew it had a shelf life and it was so long in a system that, okay, you're going to give me a drug test on Wednesday. He was the one asking for it, knowing he was still using, knowing he was going to give me a hot urine. And he did. And I processed it with my therapist. And my takeaway is he was telling on himself, just like a child would. He knew he was still struggling, but he still wanted to be honest. Like, I have to give him that grace.
Yeah. And I think the drug testing kratom at the drug houses is a newer thing, my understanding, like within the last 5 years, especially the most recovery centers per capita is in Florida, which is also the home of the largest kratom bar scene in America too. But so, yeah, it's one of those weird things to be addicted to and just be an outcast and like almost every community. What are your thoughts on balancing abstinence and harm reduction? On the podcast, we try to be open-minded, inclusive people who use cannabis or kava, or if they're not alcoholics, they might drink a half a beer now and then just to try to support them in their abstinence from kratom. And I know we are at risk of alienating some of our listeners who are more strident 12-steppers or total abstinence kind of people. But on the other hand, I bristle when some people in the harm reduction or anti-prohibitionist world who assert that any abstinent advocacy or saying abstinence is a valid pathway, they say that even that, the existence of that causes harm, that the 12 steps props up prohibitionist policies. Have you ever thought about this tension?
Oh my gosh, all the time I live this tension. Two things can exist at the same time. Harm reduction and recovery are not mutually exclusive. And I think that is because people have experienced harm from either side. Mm-hmm. They use that harm as the baseline of their belief system, which I can understand. I geared towards the evidence. Okay. So if somebody is in the acute phase of their recovery, I'm not saying that we can't work to get there, but use the tools that are available to you that increase your opportunity for wellness and to get to where you want to be. I think there's an innate pressure for abstinence. And I totally understand that with my experience of my loved one, he has to be abstinent from his experiences so far. That can change over time, right? Recovery is not linear, but where he is and what he has done in his life, his experience show that he cannot have any little bit of a substance without it graduating into something else and something chaotic. That's his story. That's not the same for everyone. I know a lot of individuals who have tried to come off of kratom became prescribed Suboxone. Suboxone is the clinical gold standard. I will always be a supporter of Suboxone. I love the injectable forms. They're low barrier. They are easier for individuals to keep up with because you don't have to go to the doctors as much. I'm not trying to be like a spokesperson for it, but I've seen firsthand the effects of that. But to go back to my original point, I don't think we should be making a permanent decision in an acute phase of our wellness, because that doesn't work within anything else that we're trying to do. If you want to fit into a dress or you want to lose a bunch of weight, like you got to work up to it, right? Like you got to start going to the gym. You have to adjust your diet, and it may not be all at once. This week's goal might be, I'm going to just drink my water, and then I'm going to go for some walks, and then I'm going to build it. You know what I mean? I think we complicate everything so much because we keep things in silos. Whereas if we really understand things as wellness journeys overall, it's really not all that different. But I will always follow the evidence of what the evidence promotes. There's no evidence for kratom. So it's really hard to be a supporter of it under how it's being managed now. It's an unsafe supply. And as a harm reductionist, that's what we're grappling with. We shouldn't have a stigma or not care about something because it's not as dangerous as something else. That's counterintuitive.
Just read the Tampa Bay's Deadly Dose. Their last segment of their 3-part series was definitely about how the current supply is unsafe. They track one of the major brands from shipping it from Southeast Asia to here and across, and it's definitely what we're buying is unsafe. If it got prohibited, it could be made more unsafe. When you're talking about the injectable forms of Suboxone, you're talking about Sublocade?
Yeah, there's Sublocade. There's also the Brixadi injection, which is newer, just received FDA approval. There's different lengths of time and dosing for each, for both Sublocade and the Brixadi injection. Brixadi, what's cool about Brixadi is it is safe for people that don't have an elevated CAL score, the clinical opioid withdrawal scale. So you don't have to wait that 32 plus hours in order to receive the medication and it not put you into precipitated withdrawal. There's a lot of factors that go into that. Of course, your route of administration, how much you're using. I suggest always, let's try to taper down our illicit use. If you're injecting, let's move to snorting, things like that over a course of time, because that will only ease that transition into the medication. And having access to additional Suboxone scripts if worsening withdrawal persists. Now, my experience with Brixadi, as well as Sublocade, is specific to fentanyl and opioids, mostly fentanyl though, because very rarely was I seeing opioids come up on a panel. I really think Brixadi or Sublocade could be incredibly transformative for people trying to come off of kratom.
What you're saying about Sublocade is lining up with just the anecdotal information I'm hearing from listeners that they're reporting positive experiences for it. And I'm not a doctor, so I can't recommend it or anything, but it definitely is a resource.
Something that's interesting with the Sublocade or the Suboxone route, I knew that was a possible alternative to come off of kratom. And I presented that to my loved one on more than one occasion. And he was so resistant on it. He had stigma so deep rooted on medications for opiate use, be it Sublocade, Vivitrol, methadone, whatever it is. He was not willing to go on Suboxone because he felt so much stigma towards that. Despite me saying, hey, you're on something that you don't even know what you're taking. And I know there's a lot of pushback on the deaths that might happen while an individual that kratom plays a part in. And there's so many coexisting factors like the tachycardia. If somebody has an underlying heart condition, if there's somebody that had previously used stimulants and they've broken down that muscle mass for years, and then they're returning to a use of kratom that he would double over with chest pain. And I'm like, he's going to have a heart attack right in front of me in the living room. But there's no warning there. So knowing what your wellness looks like when you start using these products is so important. The caffeine doses that are in a lot of the kratom drinks are astronomical in addition to the kratom that gives that stimulant effect at certain dosing. So I just wanted to speak to being an advocate for Sublocade, Suboxone, or whatever works for anybody. And there's still being this stigma from his perspective and experiences while he was on kratom. It's really hard.
It's one of the most things I'm most proud about our podcast. We've tried to be very a judgment-free zone for people that choose medicated assisted treatment. In the quitting kratom community, it's very controversial. There are people that have really strong beliefs that the use of Sublocade for a kratom addiction is overdoing it, and you're using crack cocaine to get over a Diet Coke habit. And then some other people come from the abstinent world where they using a drug to combat a drug problem is inappropriate too.
It's a medication. That's where the delineation has to come from.
Yeah.
And that's another thing of language matters. We have to be careful how we're speaking about things. It's a medication. It has clinical evidence to it. It's not a drug. And when we say drug, we think bad too. So there I just did it. I can call myself out of an unconscious bias. Like the drugs that are out on the street right now are not inherently good, but just to be conscious of that stigma of the way we speak about things. It's a medication. We don't say that about like diabetics and, oh, you didn't take care of yourself. You drank Coca-Cola and ate cupcakes every night for dinner. If it works, if it's improving your quality of life, then it's not a chaotic relationship. I think we need to give far more grace. And we don't know what the hell is in this too.
Couple of questions to wrap up just on the policy regulation solution. I really struggle because it seems like we have two horrible diametric choices on holes. We have to either choose between overreach by government, meaning a ban of kratom that leads to people being arrested for possession of kratom or reducing the safety of the kratom supply because it'll go underground, versus the excesses of capitalism. So corporations maximizing their profits from addictive products and through deceptive marketing with the lack of warnings. Any thoughts on how we can prevent the excesses of either have government overreach or capitalism run amok?
I know. It's so hard. And I got to say it again, two things can exist at the same time. It's almost like you have to weigh the harms versus the benefits and what makes the most sense, as sad as that is, because that will also leave individuals in the margins. I do believe that kratom regulation is prevention. As for the individuals that are currently using it and dependent on it, I think they at least deserve to know what's in it. Meet the kratom industry where it's at. If we can't regulate it yet, can there at least be a rule? You have to list what is what, right? Start at the baseline. Because you go to a restaurant, if you're ordering food, every restaurant has to have a calorie count now, at least where I am. And the ingredient list has to be accessible and available for consumers if they ask. Why is that any different?
Yeah. The challenge is there isn't a counterweight to the kratom industry. They have a lobby, the American Kratom Association, and they have this model language that really favors them. It's the minimum amount of regulation, and believe that it's lacking. And that is presented as that's regulation. And there isn't a counterweight because local politicians, all they have in their toolbox is to ban it or accept the kratom industry self-regulation. NTPAs have some labeling and really minimal warnings, and the kratom industry's own law is based on the premise that the FDA is completely wrong about kratom, and it, especially the federal KCPA, basically, if they got passed, would gut the FDA's ability to regulate kratom. So that's one of the barriers, because I'm a believer in legal but regulated, but I don't believe in legal and regulated by the industry itself. We don't let tobacco do that. We don't let the booze industry do that.
And the FDA can't regulate it really because there isn't evidence to support that it's good for you, right? That it's healthy, that it is safe. So the FDA has a responsibility to uphold in that end of things. Where I am, my locality is it's just an age restriction. You have to be 18. And I went into the CBD Kratom. It's like a franchise. I went into one of my local stores and had a very transparent conversation with the young woman that worked there. And she's, I like to try all of my products before I give them to other people. In the 30 minutes I was there talking to her, every single person that came in through that door to buy Kratom was in a high vis shirt, just getting off of work with a hard hat. I just say that because there is a market for it. And I don't think that the resources are made available for support for when people are struggling. And then we can get into the whole toxic narrative of masculinity and men being afraid to speak up when there is a problem, right? Because of that fear of judgment outside of drugs, just mental health as well. So there's so much work to be done in so many different areas. And it's very complicated. It's not straightforward. I've messaged a legislator local to me who was working on a bill that would have revised the Kratom Protection Act in my state. Haven't heard back. I'm at a point where I've messaged lobbyists from a very open-minded perspective because I want to understand. I do. Maybe there's parts of it that I don't know. And in order to get into those rooms and have these conversations, you have to be open-minded to a degree. But I haven't been successful with any lobbyist, with any legislator yet. But I'm going to keep trying.
One of the other belief systems that keep kratom legal is personal freedom and liberty, like body autonomy.
For sure.
The same thing. If I don't want to have a vaccine, I don't need to have a vaccine. This is a plant. If I want to use it, it's my choice. There should be zero interference from the government.
Poppy's a plant. I almost feel like the kratom industry specifically, I'm not saying they're the only industry that does this, weaponizes terminology to their favor for profit. The industry does. And that doesn't negate the individuals that use kratom in a holistic way that supports their wellness. I understand these individuals exist. But if they need to stop using it, they can't. That's where there's a problem.
Yeah. And then there's a big segment of the population we need to care about that do have a problematic relationship with kratom, or their body chemistry is different and they have a bad reaction to it, or they're prescribed a medicine from their doctor and they didn't know that there's a bad interaction if they use kratom with that prescribed medication, or they had a heart that was strained from previous meth use. And then when they mix the kratom, that puts them at risk for a cardiac event. It's a complicated thing. I thank you so much for this conversation. To get something on a lighter note, one of the questions we ask people is, what kind of music do you listen to?
Oh, I love this. I was a music major before I took the route of public health.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I wanted to be an artist in repertoire. I wanted to sign the bands to a label. That was my goal. And I've dabbled in concert photography a lot. I love 90s grunge. I love Chris Cornell. It's one of my favorite vocalists. So I'm more akin to alternative music, but I do like old school hip hop too.
All right. And any interesting travels around the world, travel plans or?
Nothing really planned. I'm just taking it day by day right now, though I'm very much focused on my career right now and the direction that I want to go. And I'm very fortunate that I have curated my life to be able to dedicate the next couple years to the things that matter to me. I've explored a lot in my life to where I just like being at home, getting my money's worth at home right now. And I'm okay with that.
Is there anything I didn't ask that you'd like to share before we say goodbye?
No, I think you covered it. I really appreciate being on this platform and then you giving the proper representation of so many different lived experiences. And if anybody's out there that is struggling to come off of it, you're not weak, you're not crazy. It is a big deal just because it may not be fentanyl or you're not copping it on a street corner. It's a harmful substance for many people and you deserve to be loved and supported.
Thank you for those words. It's going to mean a lot to many people. All right.
Thank you.
It happens to be a Friday, so have a good weekend.
Yeah, you too.
Okay.